Today we'll be talking about reducing exposure in the cloud. So the modern challenge, right? We've got so many assets now, right? We've got software-defined assets. Prior to the cloud era, everything was on-prem, everything was IP-based, things were servers, things were containers, things were endpoints, things were desktops. Fast forward to the cloud, now everything is software-defined, right? It's not just your EC2 servers, not just your containers. It's your roles, your policies, right? Your Lambda functions, your users, your groups, right? Everything is also very complex in terms of relationships, right? How are these things interconnected? How do they connect with people, process, and technologies within your organization? So, how did we, manage that in the past and the explosive growth now that we have with cloud? How do we manage that? How do we get that visibility into all these assets, right? And asset management is not just a security issue. It's really the I in the NIST security, cybersecurity framework, but really is the foundation to everything, right? You really want to understand all your assets. Kind of shadow IT is a legacy term, but how do we keep control and understand of our sprawling estates in, the cloud world? So a couple of quick stats here, right? So the ones I like to look at are the ones on the right. 165,000 plus cyber assets that the average ecosystem security team is responsible for. So think about that for a second, right? Again, it's not just your servers, not just your containers, but everything interconnected to that, right? We talked about roles, policies, whether they're AWS managed, your custom policies, how are they assigned, right? Who's assuming certain roles, which roles are attached to specific resources. So understanding that context, how everything is connected, it's a big challenge for security practitioners out there. 130 plus tools, right? All of the great sponsors here do a great job, in different areas, but how do we, correlate that? How do we get that all into a central area to understand, how things work, how things are correlated, what's scanning what. One example we like to give is think about a Lambda function, right? If you've got some code repos deployed to that Lambda function, where's that Lambda function deployed? What are the security groups surrounding it, right? So on and so forth. So connecting the dots, right? Cyber asset visibility, we'll talk a little bit about graph theory and the social graph and how we can use graph to our advantage to understand these connections, right? So kind of a bit of a mind meld for those of you familiar with the mind mapping. You can kind of see how we can kind of connect all these different assets across, right? So again, user accounts all the way down to the device endpoint agent, right? In a perfect world, you'd be able to put in a user ID or email, right, and see everything across the entire estate, right? From their IAM roles to what they, the machine they're working on, the endpoint agent, what applications they have installed, so on and so forth. So what is cyber asset attack surface management besides a really long acronym, right? It really is the persistent visibility that we can provide, right? Enabling organizations to really understand all their assets, internal, external, bringing those assets into a central portal through an API integration with existing tools, querying against them, understanding how you want to see, certain assets, how they connect, so on and so forth. And we take this beyond the CSP, right? Understanding that organizations, especially ones that are digitally cloud native, are in different domains, as you see here, right? You've got your CSPs, identity providers, infrastructure, vulnerability scanning tooling, source control, et cetera, right? How do we tie all that together? How do we see our entire posture across all of our cloud assets, right? So something to think about, whether you're strictly one CSP, multi-cloud, or just using, all these tools and many more that we integrate with, kind of just, a little bit of a thought exercise for you and your organization. So a little bit about JupiterOne, quick architecture diagram. So we pull everything in via the API. So 180 plus integrations. You can see everything across the IDP world, CSPs, We've got some vulnerability scanners, SaaS solutions, endpoint, EDRs, code repositories. Bring that into the JupiterOne platform, normalize that, aggregate, make those connections we spoke about earlier using a graph data model, right? So again, the social graph kind of became popular in the 2000s, early 2010s with social media sites. We bring that graph theory into the security world to give us those kind of connected views of all of our assets, right? And again, different domains, application code, server workloads, endpoints, so on and so forth, right? So why do graphs matter for security professionals, right? So recognizing communities, understanding the interconnected relationships, right? Some of these relationships do hold predictable paths for unauthorized users, right? Also understanding the tempo of the surface area and how quickly your assets turn over, right? Some of your assets are ephemeral, right? Containers, spin them up, they may last a couple days, you replace them with a new one, right? Completely new surface area. Pruning your graphs, right? So making sure that you understand what your graphs look like at different points in time, right? Understanding that connectivity alone is not a definitive risk measure, right? So not just that they're connected to the internet, but again, the policies, roles, and different components surrounding them. And lists are not inherently worthless. We have a saying that attackers think in graphs, right? So kind of lateral movement. And then defenders, unfortunately, we still have lists, but lists are not inherently worthless. They just need to, really work with a graph to understand kind of the scale of how we need to remediate and understand kind of the threats and the risk posture of our cloud assets. So what makes JupiterOne different? Cloud native, agentless API, so no agents needed, right? So no OVFs, no virtual appliances that you need to integrate with. We integrate across different domains, so not just, as I mentioned earlier, CSPs, but identity providers, dev workflows, endpoint security, etc. Graph database, so big users of AWS Neptune to kind of leverage database technology to make those connections with those assets, right? J1QL, so J1 query language helps. We built that from the ground up. Helps us really query the data specifically with the relationships in mind that we're looking for. And lastly, monitoring and alerts, right? So some of the posture components that we're able to alert you on, right? So certain scenarios, certain relationships that shouldn't be there, we can give you an alert and let you know that, hey, this is what we're seeing. Couple simple questions and complex ones. I'm not going to read them out, but as you can see here, some simple ones. What buckets do not have access logging enabled, and some of the more complex ones, right? Are there internet-facing EC2 instances that are allowed to access non-public S3 buckets, right? Are there cross-account IAM trust relationships, right? VPC peering across accounts, and are there S3 buckets that are potentially accessible through those VPC peerings, right? Which developers introduce new security finding, right? So we can kind of trace that back to the repository, the pull request, and understand the developers that submitted that. So a quick example, right? So again, we talked about graph and connecting your assets. So AWS security example here. We've got the internet node, security group, an EC2 cloud instance is attached to an IAM role that has a specific policy that could be accessible to an S3 bucket that is not natively or inherently public-facing. So something to think about, something that's not easily visible on the surface. Not going to see that directly in the console if you have a setup like this. And the reason JupiterOne exists, right? Really, cyber asset visibility and governance, right? The inventory of all these devices and how we can connect all these elements together, right? That's really, what our founder and CTO was looking for when he went out and built this, as a practitioner in his organization, right? He has sometimes they ask him, "What's your biggest competition?" And his response is, a spreadsheet and the VLOOKUP function, right? A lot of times, organizations are exporting this out of their consoles, trying to correlate this, either using a spreadsheet or some homegrown solution, right? Security operations. So, we can help with enriching tickets, right? Whether you're using a SIM to understand the situational awareness and events, we can provide that structural enrichment to kind of give you, a blast radius or an impact radius of, your environment. Cloud posture management. So, understanding, the different cyber hygiene of your cloud. Certain things are public facing. There's certain things are connected that shouldn't be connected. We can kind of help really alert you on those scenarios. And last, governance, risk, and compliance for audit evidence. Because we're continually pulling in and pulling this information from the respective sources, we have, we can do kind of continuous governance, continuous evidence collection for your respective audits, not just a one-time kind of screenshot or scenario like that. So. That's it. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to my talk. If you have any questions, we're right there. Come see a demo. Come ask more questions. And thank you very much.